So in this video, we'll start to look at the cerebrum in more detail and start to look at gray matter and the different regions and functionalities. So of course the gray matter, whenever we're talking gray matter, we're really talking about areas that are non-myelinated. So this largely represents the cell bodies of neurons or unmyelinated fibers. Now, the cerebral cortex is the thin outer layer, is functionally the most complex, and it covers the underlying cerebral hemispheres. Now, most of the cerebral cortex is what we call the neocortex, neo for new, because it's the most recently involved part of the brain, and it's composed of 6 layers of neurons and neuroglial cells of different widths. And certainly have a look at that in your diagram in the book, like figure 12.5, to get a visual representation of that. Now, all the neurons in the cortex fall into the group of the interneurons. Remember, interneurons do integration, they do planning, etc. Now, what is the function of the neocortex? Well, it's around things like conscious processes. So it's planning movement, interpreting sensory information that's being brought in, and complex higher functions. Now, the neocortex we could subdivide into 3 main areas. The primary motor cortex, and that gives you a little clue with that name that has to do with motor activity. The primary sensory cortices, and also association areas. And let's sort of dive into that a bit deeper. So the primary motor cortex plans and executes movement. The primary sensory cortices, these are the first regions to receive and process sensory input. Then we have all these areas that are called association areas, and they integrate different types of information. And often they help to support the primary areas. We have things that we could refer to as unimodal areas, and they integrate one specific type of information. So they really specialize in one type of information that they deal with, and or what they get in and what they put into integrate and then output. We also have the multimodal areas that integrate information from multiple different sources and carry out many higher mental functions within that area. So you got those multimodal, deal with a number of different types of information, and unimodal, their job is, hey, we're only going to work on one type of information. And we can see a functional sort of breakdown of the brain in terms of different areas. And here is that central sulcus once again. You can see it's centrally located, it's quite distinctive. And right in front of it, that basically gyrus right in front of it is the primary motor. So that's the primary motor area. And then we have an area right in front of the primary motor, which is the premotor cortex. And if we go behind the central sulcus, posterior to it, we have the primary somatosensory cortex. And we also have the somatosensory association cortex, as you can see. We have the parietal association cortexes throughout there. We have the primary visual cortex. Here's some special areas here that we'll talk about down the road. It's vernix area up here. And here's another one. As soon as you talk about vernix, you always have to think about this other area called Broca's. And it'll make more sense why I'm highlighting these, the Broca's area and vernix, because they work together on a specific task, and we'll see what that task is. We have the prefrontal cortex up here, and we have the frontal eye field, which is a little area right there. And then, not surprisingly, as I said, we have the primary visual cortex, and then we have visual association areas. So you can see we can map out a number of areas, and they're color-coded: the primary motor cortex, the primary sensory, and then the association areas. And any place that is a single task association area, one of those uni areas, has we're assigned this color, and multitask are we've highlighted in a different color in addition to that. So let's start to go deeper into this. So when I start talking motor areas, most of this is really located in towards the frontal lobe. And here we start to see that it contains something called upper motor neurons. Okay. Now, when we start talking about motor activity, the pathway between putting together a motor plan and executing it, the typical pattern we see is that there's two neurons that span that gap from where the plan's put together and the interaction with the muscle, and it's a two neuron pathway. And the ones that are in the motor area we call the upper motor neurons. And not surprisingly, we'll see there's something called lower motor neurons. Lower motor neurons output to the actual muscles, and we'll come back to that. But since the term starts to show up here, I want to give you a little explanation. So the motor areas contain the upper motor neurons. And these are interneurons that connect to other neurons, and they're not connected to the skeletal muscles directly because there's a second neuron that they'll interact with, which are called lower motor neurons, and they're the ones that connect to skeletal muscle. We have the primary motor cortex, and this is involved in conscious planning of movement, and it's located in the precentral gyrus. So remember, precentral gyrus is in front of that central sulcus. The upper motor neurons of each cerebral hemisphere control motor activity of the opposite, let's highlight that, the opposite side of the body. How do they do this? Well, the information has to cross. It has to go from one side to the other. So it's contralateral, if you remember that term, is that planning is on one side of the brain, but the output is on the other side of the body. And that's accomplished by the lower motor neurons, and they're the ones that actually take the information right to the neurons, not the neurons, I should say, but to the muscles. And these are really peripheral nervous system neurons. Now, movement requires input from many motor association areas, and this is very typical that a primary area like the primary motor, primary sensory areas, they rely upon input from association areas. So movements require input from many motor association areas, and one of the big ones is the premotor cortex, which is just anterior, just in front of the primary motor cortex. Now the motor association areas, they're unimodal areas. And what do? They're involved in planning, guidance, coordination, and execution of movement. And you think about movement, it's very complex. You have to coordinate a number of muscles. Who's going to contract first? Who's going to stabilize a joint? Which muscles are going to basically have to relax while certain muscles move in opposing groups? And then there's a timing issue that has to be built in. So movement is actually a quite complex task and requires the input of many parts of the brain. But it's largely, the game plan is largely put together by the primary motor area and the motor association areas, but it's also helped, as we'll see, by some of the deeper things like the basal nuclei in the brain, and we'll come to those. We have the frontal eye fields, I should say, and these are interesting because these are paired motor association areas, one on each side of the brain, and they specialize in back to forth eye movements, which are what you do whenever you read. So you can see certain areas of the brain take on very specific tasks. Now, we're going to end there, and we're going to come back and talk about the sensory, a bit of an overview of the sensory. We've just kind of walked through the motor area and some of the basic architecture.